Aaron's hand, my only son's hand, pressed flat against my chest. Then he pushed. It wasn't a hard shove. It wasn't violent. But it was enough to draw a line that could never be crossed again. The heavy oak door of the church slowly swung shut. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated once inside my pocket. Email sent successfully. I watched Aaron's back disappear into the building. "Check your phone later, son." I whispered the words to myself. My voice was as calm as a frozen lake. Then I turned away and walked down the stone steps. One step, then another. The sharp sound of my leather shoes echoed against the pavement. Behind me, the massive oak door slammed shut. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories always had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue this journey together, and don't forget to subscribe. You're going to want to hear how this story ends. Wedding music drifted from behind the church doors. Steady, cold, unforgiving. I stood alone on the gray stone steps beneath an overcast autumn sky. The wind cut across my face. Even the expensive 3-piece tweed suit I wore couldn't stop the sudden chill. But the cold wasn't what numbed me. The real pain came from knowing that my own son had forbidden me from attending his wedding. Aaron's eyes held no warmth, no affection, no trace of family. Only suspicion and a poorly disguised contempt. "The family has already decided, Dad. You're not part of us anymore." Every word landed with perfect clarity. I saw hesitation flicker across his face. For a moment, just a moment. Then blind pride won. He turned his back on me. He adjusted the collar of his spotless white shirt and walked back into the sanctuary where Stephanie waited in a designer wedding gown purchased with a credit card tied directly to my account. I remained silent. I didn't beg. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene and turn myself into a pitiful old man. 20 years in business had taught me one lesson above all others: the person who wins never needs to raise his voice. I lifted a hand and carefully straightened my silk tie. Then I took a slow breath. The scent of candles and fresh lilies drifted from inside the church. The irony was almost laughable. The engine of the Mercedes came to life. Its low, powerful rumble shattered the silence outside the church. I leaned back against the leather seat and stared out the window as rows of leafless trees drifted past. My mind traveled back 3 years. Back to a hospital room saturated with the smell of antiseptic. Back to the place where Catherine took her final breaths. My wife's hand had become painfully thin. Blue veins stood out beneath her pale skin. She squeezed my hand. The grip was weak, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 promises. Catherine looked at me through eyes clouded by illness. She was entrusting our only son to me. "Protect him, Gerald. Even if he has to hate you to grow up. He's too emotional. He doesn't see through people the way you do." Then she was gone. Before her death, she left behind a confidential will prepared by Attorney Patterson. None of her vast estate was transferred directly to Aaron. The inheritance included 3 manufacturing plants that operated around the clock, 2 prime commercial properties in the heart of the city's business district, and a portfolio of investments quietly generating wealth in the background. Everything was placed under my management. I became the keeper of a treasure chest. Aaron, however, believed I had stolen what rightfully belonged to him. He wanted independence. He wanted freedom. What he didn't understand was that freedom in the business world always comes with wolves lurking in the shadows. Catherine had used her fortune and ultimately her life to create a brutal test of character for her son. I had promised my late wife that I would protect him. So I accepted the role of the cold, authoritarian father. I watched in silence as he slowly drifted away from his family. Then Stephanie entered our lives. She was the first person who made me question the promise I had made to Catherine. Stephanie did not arrive because she loved Aaron. She arrived for something far more dangerous. She was the opening move in a perfectly executed takeover plan, and Aaron had absolutely no idea he was the target. I remember that Sunday afternoon as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Aaron brought Stephanie to our old family lodge for the first time. She wore an elegant cream-colored dress. A gentle smile never seemed to leave her lips. Everything about her was flawless. The way she walked, the way she spoke, the way she greeted people. She was so perfectly composed that finding a fault felt impossible. Aaron looked at her with the devotion of a man hopelessly in love. He proudly introduced her as the woman he intended to spend the rest of his life with. But I wasn't watching her smile. I was watching her eyes. As Stephanie stepped into the living room, her gaze swept across the family oil painting hanging above the fireplace. Then it paused for 3 seconds on a Ming Dynasty vase displayed on a nearby shelf. There was no admiration in her expression, no appreciation for history, no curiosity about art. What I saw was something else entirely. It was the cold, calculating look of a property appraiser assessing value. She wasn't seeing heirlooms, she was seeing numbers. She was estimating the worth of everything around her. During dinner, Stephanie skillfully guided the conversation toward the family businesses. She asked about the factories. She asked about last quarter's revenue. She asked about the current ownership structure. Aaron answered every question honestly, without hesitation, without suspicion. Watching my son's innocence on full display sent a sharp pain through my chest. I set down my knife and fork. The metallic clink against the china echoed through the dining room. Cold, sharp, deliberate. Then I looked directly at Stephanie. The atmosphere at the table changed immediately. After dinner, I pulled Aaron into my study. I shut the door behind us. Then I told him exactly what I thought. Aaron, that woman isn't looking at you. She's looking at this family's bank statements. Wake up. The reaction was instant. He exploded. He accused me of being judgmental. He accused me of being selfish. He accused me of trying to control his life. What he didn't understand was that I had spent decades in business. I had met hundreds of people like Stephanie, people who wore the face of an angel while carrying the heart of a venomous snake. That night marked the beginning of the fracture between my son and me, and Stephanie noticed it immediately. She realized that I was the single greatest obstacle standing between her and what she wanted. From that moment forward, the game changed. The snake had identified its enemy, and it began releasing its poison one drop at a time, until my son was completely isolated from the only person still trying to protect him. The weeks that followed became a patient and calculated psychological campaign orchestrated by Stephanie. She never argued with me. She never raised her voice. Instead, she used silence. She used wounded expressions. She used carefully timed tears. And worst of all, she used Aaron's love for her as a weapon. Every time I offered business advice, Aaron pushed back. Every suggestion became an argument. Every concern became an accusation. I began noticing a pattern. His opinions no longer sounded like his own. One afternoon at the office, I finally asked him a question. When did all your business decisions start with the words, Stephanie thinks? Aaron didn't answer. He simply stared at me with growing resentment. Then he told me that Stephanie felt unwelcome in this family. She felt disrespected. She felt judged. Little by little, she had succeeded in transforming me into a tyrant in my son's eyes. The division between us happened quietly, but it was ruthless. Aaron slowly became a reflection of someone else. He no longer made decisions independently. He merely repeated ideas that had been whispered into his ear the night before. The greatest pain a father can experience is not watching his child fail. It is watching his child willingly surrender his future to a deceiver. I watched Aaron grow thinner. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. Stress followed him everywhere. Yet he defended Stephanie with the blind devotion of a moth rushing toward a flame. Then things became even worse. Stephanie began controlling his communications. One day I discovered that my number had been blocked on Aaron's phone. Her explanation was simple. She claimed she was helping him reduce stress. I sat alone in my study that night. The steady ticking of the clock echoed through the darkness. The sound seemed louder than usual. On my desk sat a family photograph taken 10 years earlier. Catherine's smile shone brightly from the frame. Aaron stood beside her, younger and carefree, and I stood behind them both, believing our family would always remain intact. For the first time, doubt crept into my mind. Was I doing the right thing? Had my promise to Catherine gone too far? I stared at her photograph for a long time. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I couldn't stop. Not now, because wolves never walk away from a wounded target. They stay until there is nothing left. Then the moment I had feared finally arrived. One evening, Aaron returned to the house without warning. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send a message. He simply appeared at the front door. Stephanie stood beside him. In her hands was a thick stack of documents. The moment I saw those papers, I knew they hadn't come to visit. This wasn't a family gathering. This wasn't a reconciliation. This was a negotiation, or perhaps a demand. For the first time, Stephanie made no effort to hide who she really was. The warm smile was gone. The gentle voice was gone. The innocent mask had disappeared completely. What remained was the expression of someone arriving to collect a debt, a predator who believed victory was already within reach. Aaron walked into the kitchen. Stephanie followed close behind, and as they placed those documents on the familiar wooden table where our family had shared thousands of meals, I realized something. The real war was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and it was about to begin in the heart of my own home. They sat across from me at the kitchen table. Stephanie gently slid the folder toward my side. The rough paper scraped softly across the wooden surface. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. A property transfer agreement. She wanted me to sign over ownership of the family home and surrounding land to Aaron immediately. According to her, it was simply a practical step, a way to secure their future, a way to strengthen their marriage. Her voice remained calm and pleasant, but beneath that polished tone lay unmistakable pressure. I didn't look at the documents. Instead, I looked directly at my son. "Is this what you want, Aaron?" The silence that followed was the most painful answer I had ever received. Aaron lowered his head, his fingers intertwined tightly in front of him. He couldn't meet my eyes. But he didn't stop Stephanie either. In that moment, I realized how completely she had broken his independence. The courage that should have allowed him to speak for himself had been crushed. His silence cut deeper than any insult. It felt like a knife sliding straight through the last reserve of patience I possessed. Inside my pocket, I clenched my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Anger surged through my chest, hot, relentless, dangerous. Yet my face remained perfectly calm. Years of business negotiations had taught me how to hide storms behind still water. Slowly, I rose from my chair. I picked up the agreement. For a brief moment, Stephanie smiled. She thought she had won. Then I walked to the trash bin beside the counter and dropped the entire contract inside. The room went silent. Stephanie's smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face. Her red-painted lips tightened into a thin line. For the first time, I saw genuine anger flash across her eyes. Aaron looked up in shock. Then he exploded. "You're being selfish." His voice echoed through the kitchen. "You care more about your property than my happiness." The words came faster after that. Sharper, crueler. Years of resentment poured out of him. Then came the ultimatum. "If you don't sign, I'm done with you." He stood up from his chair. "You'll never be part of my wedding. You'll never see me again." Beside him, Stephanie reached for his hand. The gesture was perfectly timed, perfectly rehearsed. She played the role of the wounded fiancé while Aaron fought her battle for her. I listened without interrupting. When he finally finished, I spoke only once. "Then, you'll have to live with what you just said. Nothing more. Nothing less." A few minutes later, they left. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the entire house. Then silence returned. A heavy silence. The kind that settles into empty rooms after something precious has been broken. I stood alone in the darkness of the kitchen. My chest ached. Not because of the property, not because of the threats, but because I had just watched my son choose someone else's voice over his own. For several minutes I remained motionless. Then the businessman inside me took control once again. Emotion stepped aside. Logic took its place. I had delayed long enough. The time for warnings was over. The hunter could no longer remain in the shadows. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had known for years. Patterson answered on the second ring. "I need everything I said." There was a brief pause. Then his voice turned serious. "You finally decided to move, yes?" I looked out the window into the darkness. "The investigation starts tonight." After another moment of silence, Patterson replied with two simple words. "Understood." The call ended. And that night, an invisible net began tightening around the perfect woman my son believed he knew. For the first time, Stephanie was no longer hunting. She had become the prey. My call with Patterson lasted less than 2 minutes. He understood the situation immediately. The next morning, I sat in a discreet office tucked away on the 18th floor of a downtown high-rise. Cold air drifted from the central ventilation system. The room smelled of old documents and bitter coffee. Across the glass conference table sat Patterson and another woman, Patricia. The finest private investigator I had ever worked with. Without a word, I slid a photograph of Stephanie across the table. I want everything behind this face, I said. No assumptions, no rumors, only facts that can stand in court. Patricia picked up the photograph. She studied it briefly. Then she gave a single decisive nod. Nothing more. No questions. No promises. She simply stood and walked out. In business, the winner is rarely the person who strikes first. The winner is the person holding the strongest evidence when the battle begins. I knew patience would be my greatest weapon. 3 days later, Patterson sent me an encrypted file. I opened it in my study shortly after midnight. As the first pages appeared on the screen, a chill ran through my body. The woman calling herself Stephanie was not Stephanie at all. Her real name was Cheryl. The identity she had presented to us was fabricated with remarkable sophistication, but that was only the beginning. The report revealed 2 prior convictions involving fraud and financial deception in another state. The pattern was unmistakable. Find a wealthy and trusting man, gain his confidence. Secure financial access. Drain what could be taken, disappear, then repeat the process with someone new. I stared at the screen for several moments without moving, but the next section was even worse. Patricia had uncovered evidence that Cheryl had already obtained significant control over Aaron's finances. 2 months earlier, my son had signed a series of authorization documents, granting her extensive access to his accounts. The transfers had started gradually, small amounts designed to avoid attention. But together they formed a clear picture. Money was quietly being redirected into offshore accounts. The final transaction had not yet occurred, but the plan was obvious. She was preparing for one last sweep, a complete extraction, and the wedding appeared to be the final step before she vanished with everything she could take. Slowly I closed the file. The room felt colder than before. My hand remained on the desk. Part of me was furious. Part of me was heartbroken. Aaron wasn't greedy. He wasn't malicious. He was simply blind. My son was walking across a collapsing bridge and calling it a path to paradise. I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Far below, the city stretched into the darkness. Traffic lights flickered. Buildings glowed. Thousands of lives moved in every direction. And somewhere in that vast maze, my son was unknowingly racing toward disaster. That was the moment I made my decision. Waiting was no longer an option. The evidence was real. The threat was real. And now so was the plan. A legal strategy began taking shape piece by piece. Careful, précis, unavoidable. Cheryl believed she was days away from victory. She had no idea that every step she had taken was already being documented. Every account, every transfer, every lie, every false identity. The trap was no longer being built. It was ready. And when the time came, it would close all at once. If you've made it this far into the story, thank you for staying with us. Take a moment to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the journey. Leave a number 5 in the comments so I know you've reached this point, and tell me how you think this story ends. I'm curious to see who can predict the final outcome. Many people watch without doing those things, and that's completely fine. But if you choose to support the channel, it truly means a lot and helps us continue bringing stories like this to life. The case file on Cheryl, better known to my son as Stephanie, rested securely inside my leather briefcase. Every page was supported by evidence. Official investigative reports, certified court records, photographs of her standing outside a courthouse 3 years earlier, copies of financial documents, orders related to frozen accounts. Everything was documented, everything was verifiable, and most importantly, everything was impossible to explain away. I sat alone in the worn leather armchair in my living room. The house was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, heavy, relentless. I wasn't preparing a threat. I was preparing the truth. There is a difference. I knew Aaron too well. If I walked into the church that morning and threw the evidence in front of him, he would never believe it. Not now. Not after months of manipulation. He would assume I had fabricated everything. He would convince himself I was trying to destroy his happiness. Stephanie's influence had sunk too deep into his mind. The more I pushed, the harder he would resist. Youth has a dangerous relationship with pride. Sometimes people would rather fall than admit they were warned. No, I needed something stronger, something undeniable. A single decisive strike delivered at the exact moment Stephanie believed she had won. That evening I made one final call to Patterson. Together we reviewed every legal safeguard one last time. The ownership structures surrounding Catherine's estate had been reinforced beyond challenge. The 3 manufacturing plants were protected. The commercial properties were protected. The investment holdings were protected. Not a single dollar of Catherine's legacy could be touched. Stephanie had spent months chasing wealth that legally did not belong to Aaron in the first place. Then Patterson confirmed the second phase. The review of Aaron's joint financial arrangements was complete. The necessary legal filings were ready. Everything had been scheduled. The timing was precise. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock, the exact hour Aaron and Stephanie planned to celebrate with family and guests at the church. I ended the call and looked at the clock on the mantel. Time was running out. For months, I had given Aaron opportunity after opportunity, chance after chance, warning after warning. He had ignored everyone. Instead, he had chosen to push me out of his life. Now I had no choice but to protect him the only way I knew how. As a father, as a businessman, as a man who had spent decades recognizing danger before others could see it. That night on the eve of my son's wedding, I never went to bed. Instead, I sat at my desk, polishing an old silver pocket watch that had belonged to my father. The same watch he carried every day until the day he died. The rhythmic movement of the cloth across the silver surface helped calm my thoughts. Tomorrow, the empire of lies Stephanie had built would collide with reality. Tomorrow, the truth would arrive, and when it did, it would arrive carrying the full weight of the law. I was ready to press send, ready to release every document, every report, every piece of evidence, ready to expose everything. But fate had one final surprise waiting for me. Near midnight, a sudden pounding erupted from the front door. Not a polite knock, not a hesitant tap. A desperate pounding. Rapid, urgent, unrelenting. I frowned and checked the clock. Who would come here at this hour? The knocking continued, harder this time. 3 heavy blows that echoed through the silent house. Slowly I stood from my chair. The pocket watch remained in my hand. Something about the sound unsettled me. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor. It wasn't the knock of a friend. It sounded like someone running out of time. As I approached the front door, a strange feeling settled into my chest. Instinct. The same instinct that had protected me in business for decades. I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle, and opened the door. What I saw standing on the porch instantly changed everything. The unexpected visitor that night wasn't Aaron. It was Patricia. She arrived carrying one final piece of information. Stephanie had purchased a one-way international plane ticket scheduled to depart at 8 o'clock the following evening. There was no return flight, no explanation, no reason that made sense for a newly married woman supposedly planning a future with her husband. The meaning was obvious. She intended to disappear. The moment the wedding was over, she planned to take whatever she could and leave the country behind. I listened quietly. Then I nodded. Every piece was finally in place. The board was set, and the game was over. The following afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, I stood outside the church and endured my son's rejection. Just as I told you before, Aaron placed his hand against my chest, pushed me away, and closed the door to his life. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. For 2 minutes, I remained standing alone in the cold wind. Then I reached into my pocket and removed my phone. 3:10 in the afternoon. Right on schedule. I looked at the screen, took a breath, and pressed send. In an instant, a PDF containing the complete investigative file was delivered. Court records, financial reports, identity documents, photographic evidence, everything. The file went directly to Aaron. It went to Stephanie's parents. It went to several business associates attending the wedding. And it went to every person who needed to see the truth. The church bells rang, then stopped, and with a single tap of my finger, the empire Stephanie had spent years constructing began to collapse. Through a narrow stained glass window, I saw the first signs of chaos unfolding inside. The wedding music abruptly died. Conversations erupted. Confusion spread across the sanctuary. Aaron, standing at the altar, glanced down at his phone. Seconds later, the color vanished from his face. He stared at the screen, frozen, Page after page appeared before him. Legal records, photographs, evidence. The woman he believed he loved suddenly became a stranger. I watched him scroll. His hands trembled. Then he looked up. His eyes found Stephanie. Shock, disbelief, horror, all of it was written across his face. At almost the same moment, Stephanie checked her own phone. A banking notification. The joint accounts had been restricted. The transfers were finished. The escape route was gone. For a brief second, panic flashed across her face. Her mask finally cracked. There were no tears, no explanations, no desperate declarations of innocence. She simply turned and ran. Lifting the expensive wedding dress with both hands, she rushed toward a rear exit of the church. But she never made it far. Patricia was already waiting. So were two police officers. The moment Stephanie stepped outside, they approached. The sound of handcuffs closing around her wrists echoed sharply beyond the doors. Cold, final, inescapable. Inside the sanctuary, the guests sat in stunned silence. Nobody understood what had happened, yet everyone understood enough. The wedding was over. Aaron stood motionless for several seconds. Then his knees gave out. He collapsed in the center aisle. The wedding ring slipped from his fingers. It rolled across the polished floor, spinning, turning, until it finally came to rest beneath a row of empty seats, a symbol of a future that no longer existed. I could have gone inside. I could have watched every second. I could have witnessed the complete destruction of the illusion. But I didn't. I turned around, walked back toward my car, and left, because defeating an enemy was never my goal. Saving my son was. The battle against Stephanie had ended. That part was finished. What frightened me now was something else entirely. For the first time in months, Aaron would be forced to face reality. Alone. No lies. No manipulation. No one whispering answers into his ear. Only the truth. And truth can be far more painful than betrayal. As I opened the car door, one question lingered in my mind. What would happen when my son finally returned to our empty house? What would he do when he realized that everything he had sacrificed, including his relationship with his father, had been for a lie? That answer, I suspected, would be the hardest part of the story. That night, rain poured from the sky without mercy. Droplets clung to the windows like ghosts from the past, refusing to let go. I sat alone in the darkness of the old kitchen. Only a faint glow from a distant street lamp slipped through the curtains. Rain hammered against the roof. The sound was relentless. Around 11 o'clock, headlights appeared through the storm. A taxi pulled into the driveway. I watched silently. A moment later, the back door opened. Aaron stepped inside. He looked nothing like the man who had stood at the altar earlier that day. His expensive gray-blue wedding suit was soaked through. Mud stained the fabric. The jacket hung loosely from his shoulders. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't say a word. Slowly, he walked toward the kitchen table. Then his legs gave way. He collapsed onto the cold tile floor. The first sob escaped before he could stop it. Then another. Then another. The sound tore through the darkness. His shoulders shook violently. It wasn't the cry of a grown man. It was the cry of a child who had finally realized he had destroyed something precious with his own hands. I didn't rush to him. I didn't pull him into an embrace. I remained seated, still, quiet. I needed him to face this pain, to understand it, to feel every part of it. Aaron finally looked up. Tears streamed down his face. His voice was barely audible. I didn't know who she really was. I looked directly into his eyes. My answer was calm, steady. I know. A long silence filled the room. Then I spoke again. That's why I tried to stop you. The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Aaron lowered his head. Then, like he had when he was a little boy, frightened by thunderstorms, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against my knee. The gesture nearly broke my heart. I'm sorry, Dad. The words came out shattered. I'm sorry for everything. He apologized for the insults, for the threats, for choosing someone else over his own family. He said he had lost everything, his reputation, his confidence, his future. The life he thought he was building had disappeared the moment the handcuffs closed around Stephanie's wrists. Slowly I raised my rough hand and placed it on his rain-soaked hair. For a long time neither of us spoke. I simply sat there while my son cried. The storm outside continued. The storm inside him slowly began to fade. Eventually, the sobs became quieter, then weaker, then silence. I knew the lesson had been brutal, far more brutal than I had ever wanted. But some truths can only be learned through pain, and some mistakes become the tuition paid for wisdom. When Aaron finally exhausted every tear he had left, I stood up. He looked at me with red, swollen eyes, confused, exhausted, broken. Without a word, I walked across the room toward the old wall safe hidden behind a framed landscape painting. The combination lock clicked softly beneath my fingers. Aaron watched silently. I opened the safe. Inside were documents, letters, and one sealed envelope that had remained untouched for 3 years. The envelope bore a single name written in Catherine's elegant handwriting. Aaron. My son stared at it, his breathing caught. I carefully removed the envelope and held it in my hands. For 3 years I had protected what was inside. For 3 years I had carried the burden of a promise made beside a hospital bed, a promise made to the woman we both loved. I turned back toward Aaron. His eyes never left the envelope. "What is that?" he whispered. For the first time that night, emotion cracked through my calm expression. I looked at my son, then at the letter, and finally spoke. "It's the last thing your mother ever asked me to keep from you." The room fell silent. Even the rain seemed distant. Aaron slowly rose to his feet. His hands trembled, because somehow, despite everything that had happened that day, he sensed this was different. This wasn't about Stephanie. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about betrayal. This was about Catherine, and the truth she had carried with her until the very end. A truth that was about to change the way Aaron understood his mother, his father, and perhaps his entire life. I placed a small ebony box on the kitchen table. Inside was a handwritten letter from Catherine, its pages yellowed by time. Beside it rested the master key to all 3 manufacturing plants. Aaron's hands trembled as he opened the letter. His mother's familiar handwriting appeared before him. Elegant, gentle, unmistakable. As he read, the room fell silent. Catherine had seen her son's weaknesses long before illness took her away. She knew how deeply he felt. She knew how easily his heart could be influenced. And she knew that one day he would face a choice between appearances and truth. In her letter, she explained that the family fortune was never meant to be a privilege. It was a responsibility, a burden that could crush a person who was unprepared to carry it. She wrote that the inheritance would only truly belong to Aaron when he learned how to see through deception, recognize character, and place family above wealth. Every word seemed to strike directly at the wounds he carried. By the time he reached the end of the letter, tears were falling again. But these were different tears. Not tears of despair, not tears of humiliation. These were tears of understanding. Slowly, Aaron folded the letter. Then he stood. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. For the first time in years, there was no resentment in his eyes. No anger, no suspicion, only respect. The kind of respect a son gives a father after finally understanding the sacrifices that were made for him. Without a word, I handed him the master key. He accepted it carefully, as though he understood its true weight at last. The following morning, Aaron surprised everyone. The expensive designer suits disappeared. The luxury watches disappeared. The polished image he had spent years building disappeared with them. Instead, he arrived at the factory wearing a worker's uniform. No special treatment. No executive office. No shortcuts. He walked through the production floor as a student rather than an owner. He shook hands with employees he had never bothered to know before. He listened more than he spoke, and for the first time in his life he was willing to learn from the ground up. The circle had finally closed. The lost son had truly come home. Thank you for joining us on Dad's Real-Life Revenge. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss future stories and lessons. We'll see you again in the next video. Before you go, remember this: never waste your energy trying to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Use that energy instead to gather facts, protect what matters, and stand firm when the people you love need you most. That was the greatest lesson I wanted my son to learn, and perhaps it is the lesson I would offer to you as well. Kindness without wisdom is often an invitation to be exploited. Stay observant, stay calm, protect your family with both compassion and good judgment, because in life a strong heart is valuable, but a strong heart guided by wisdom is truly priceless.